This mid-18th century geographic map presents Florida as a rugged peninsula at the far edge of the Atlantic world. Coastlines are generalized, interior rivers are sketched in broad strokes, and native homelands appear as vague regions rather than precise boundaries. It captures how Europeans imagined Florida on the eve of the 7 Years' War, more as a strategic frontier than a fully known landscape. This coastal chart runs from the Dry Tortugas up to Cape Florida, focusing on shoals, reefs, and sailing hazards rather than inland detail. Soundings, islands, and capes are carefully plotted, revealing how mariners threaded a narrow corridor between the Gulf and the reef-lined straits. By mapping danger as much as land, it shows Florida as a maritime gauntlet guarding the approaches to Havana and the Atlantic seaboard. This plan links Fort Mose with the town and defenses of St. Augustine, highlighting Spain's black militia refuge just north of the city. Roads, marshes, and fields reveal a military landscape built to slow and funnel British attacks toward Castillo de San Marcos. It is a rare visual record of an early free black community and its role in the defensive system of Spanish Florida. Here, the St. Augustine Inlet, sandbars, and town are drawn together as a single defensive system. Bars and channels control how ships approach the harbor, while bastions and walls guard the waterfront once they arrive. The map shows why St. Augustine endured, geography and fortifications working together to make assault by sea both treacherous and costly. This plan of Pensacola, Santa Maria de Galve, sits on the deep protected waters of Pensacola Bay. Forts, batteries, and anchorage points frame the harbor as Spain's western shield against British expansion from the Atlantic colonies. On the eve of Britain's takeover in 1763, the map captures a Spanish outpost that both guarded and contested control of the northern Gulf. By 1762, St. Augustine appears here as a compact walled town wrapped around a sheltered harbor. The plan shows streets, plazas, and the stone fortress tied directly to anchorage, docks, and channel. Drawn just before Britain briefly gained Florida, it freezes a mature Spanish town on the brink of becoming a British imperial outpost. This 1763 map announces Britain's new governments of East and West Florida after the Treaty of Paris. It stretches from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi, carving Spanish and indigenous lands into fresh British colonies. An inset plan of Pensacola underscores the Gulf port's strategic value as London sought to secure its southern flank during the Revolutionary era. Drawn in Italian, this plan of St. Augustine and its port translates Spain's North Florida stronghold for a European audience. The grid of streets, the massive fortress, and surrounding waterways are measured in miglia, or Italian miles. It shows how far news of this small Florida town traveled, and how European powers watched the struggle for the peninsula from afar. This Italian map of the Florida Peninsula sketches a long, narrow landmass between the Gulf of Mexico and the Bahama Channel. Coastal keys, capes, and channels receive more attention than the sparsely mapped interior. It captures Florida as a maritime crossroads, where European navigators cared more about currents and passages than about inland towns. Here, an Italian plan zooms into Pensacola's harbor, barrier island, and settlements. Depth soundings, channels, and labeled features like Santa Rosa Island show why this anchorage mattered. The map reflects broader European interest in who would command the deep water ports of the Gulf during the age of imperial rivalry. Surveyed by George Gauld, this English chart of Pensacola Harbor is a technical piece of hydrography. Precise soundings, coastal profiles, and written remarks reveal Britain's drive to scientifically measure its new West Florida assets. It turns Pensacola Bay into data, transforming a contested shoreline into a navigable, militarized imperial harbor. This French chart by Belin portrays Pensacola Bay with elegant cartouches and careful soundings. Even after losing territory, France continued to map Spain's and Britain's Gulf positions, tracking rivals from a distance. The map reads like both nautical guide and intelligence report on a harbor central to control of the northern Gulf of Mexico. This reduced chart ties Louisiana's delta, the northern Gulf Coast, and Florida's shores into a single navigational frame. Rivers, bays, and offshore shoals reveal how ships moved between Caribbean, Mississippi, and Atlantic worlds. It underscores that Florida was never isolated. It was one leg of a triangle binding New Orleans, Havana, and British North America. Belin's plan of St. Augustine's port combines French cartographic style with Spanish urban reality. The harbor mouth, anchorage, and town appear as one fortified unit pressed against the Atlantic. Produced from afar, it shows how foreign mapmakers reconstructed Spain's oldest North American town from reports, charts, and captured intelligence. This chart sweeps from Mobile along the Florida coast down to the Keys, tracing bays, inlets, and offshore banks. It documents a chain of harbors that could shelter fleets or launch attacks across the Gulf. In the Revolutionary era, this corridor became the watery highway linking British West Florida, Spanish Louisiana, and the wider Caribbean War. Marketed as new and accurate, this English plan repackages St. Augustine for British readers. Streets, defenses, and harbor facilities are redrawn from a conquering power's perspective, emphasizing order and control. The map turns a centuries-old Spanish town into a freshly rebranded British garrison on America's southern frontier. Proctor's map lays out East and West Florida as twin British provinces. Rivers, coastal features, and boundary lines advertise opportunities for plantations and trade. It helps sell Florida to prospective settlers and investors, just as tensions with the older Atlantic colonies were beginning to build. De Brahm's coastal charts, including detailed sheets of the Bahama Channel and Cape Florida, offer dense soundings, notes, and compass roses. They are field manuals for imperial navigation for one of the world's most dangerous shipping lanes. This chart shows a stretch of Florida's Atlantic coast from about 26.5 to 27 degrees north. You can see the Little Inlet River meeting the Hillsborough River, along with nearby islands and shoreline. Back in 1765, sailors used maps like this to spot shallow areas and find safe paths along the coast. This chart covers the southern part of Florida's Atlantic coast and the nearby Bahama Channel. The Bahama Channel was a busy shipping lane, so knowing where the reefs and sandbars were really mattered. Maps like this helped captains steer clear of hazards and move people and goods safely through the area. This map zooms in on Cape Florida, the tip of the peninsula where land meets open water. It highlights the tricky shoals and sandbars that made this spot dangerous for ships. Sailors relied on charts like this to judge how close they could get to shore without running aground. This chart focuses on Mosquito Inlet, one of the gateways from the Atlantic into calmer inland waters. It shows the channels, sandbars, and shallow spots at the inlet's mouth. For 18th century ships, this kind of detail could be the difference between a safe entry and getting stuck on the bar. This colored plan presents Pensacola as a gridded British town anchored by a central fort. Numbered lots, gardens, and surrounding swamps reveal both ambition and environmental constraint. It shows how Britain tried to impose rectangular order on a humid Gulf landscape that would ultimately be swept back into Spanish control. This manuscript chart tracks the North Florida coast from Cape Blaze to Apalachicola Bay. Islands, sounds, and meticulous soundings describe a shallow, shifting shore. The map reveals a little-known reach of coastline that quietly linked British West Florida, Creek Country, and the open Gulf. Here, Fort George crowns a hill above Pensacola, surrounded by outworks and batteries. The plan is a study in overlapping fields of fire and engineered earthworks. It foreshadows the sieges to come, when this high ground would become the focal point of the 1781 Spanish attack on British Pensacola. Bernard Romans's chart of Pensacola Harbor blends careful surveying with narrative notes. He plots shoals, channels, and anchorages while commenting on winds, tides, and local conditions. This is a Patriot-era eye studying a British Gulf stronghold that would soon be contested in the wider revolutionary struggle. This map strings together the Gulf littoral from Pensacola west to the Iberville River, near today's Mississippi-Louisiana border. Rivers, bays, and portages show how water routes stitched plantations, forts, and native communities into a single corridor. It captures a British West Florida stretched between Atlantic colonies to the east and French-Spanish Louisiana to the west. D. Brahms' ancient Tegesta map renames the Florida Peninsula with a classical-sounding identity. He overlays indigenous place names with Enlightenment geography and speculation. The map turns Florida into both a scientific object and a canvas for European myth-making at the dawn of the Revolutionary period. Jeffries's chart captures the entire arc from Louisiana's coast across West Florida to the Florida Keys. It appears just as political tensions spill into open rebellion further north. The map underscores how control of these coasts, and the sea lanes wrapping them, would shape the global dimension of the American Revolution. Romans's general map assembles the southern colonies, including East and West Florida, into a single frame. Colonial borders, rivers, and port towns appear alongside vast labeled indigenous territories. Published in the year of American independence, it shows the South, Florida included, as a contested zone within a collapsing British Empire. This plan of Amelia Island pairs with a chart of the St. Mary's River Bar and Channel. It highlights a barrier island gateway between British East Florida and the rebellious Georgia coast. Whoever held these inlets controlled a backdoor route for trade, smuggling, and military movement during the Revolutionary War. Here, a wartime chart links segments of the Florida and Louisiana coasts. Harbors, shoals, and islands are mapped as potential staging grounds for fleets and raids. It reflects how the Gulf became a secondary theater of the Revolution, where European powers maneuvered for advantage. This actual survey of Pensacola and its surroundings shows a town, fortifications, and landscape measured on the ground. Hills, marshes, and approach roads frame the harbor fortress. 2 years later, this carefully mapped terrain would become a battlefield during the Spanish siege of 1781. This map links the Bay of Espiritu Santo, Tampa Bay, with St. Augustine on Florida's Atlantic side. It visually connects Gulf and Atlantic coasts across a still mysterious interior. The chart hints at Florida's potential as a trans-peninsular corridor, even before such routes were fully explored or exploited. This detailed chart focuses on Amelia Island's port and bar, mapping shoals and channels in fine detail. It was essential for pilots trying to slip ships in and out of East Florida's northern gateway. In a war of blockades and privateers, such minor inlets could decide whether supplies reached Loyalist strongholds or rebel forces. Here, Amelia Island itself is the subject, with its shape, beaches, and interior features carefully laid out. The map showcases an island outpost guarding entry to the St. Mary's River. Once the war ended, this barrier island would remain a magnet for smugglers, filibusters, and rival flags along the Florida-Georgia line. This follow-up plan integrates Amelia Island into the broader East Florida coastline. It shows how the island sits like a plug in the coastal corridor between Carolina and St. Augustine. Forts and channels here mark the northern edge of Britain's remaining foothold after losing the older colonies to rebellion. This chart traces the northeast Gulf shore, including parts of Florida's panhandle. Bays, capes, and offshore banks appear as stepping stones along a strategic rim. The map sits at the moment when Spanish and British forces eyed these same waters as routes to strike each other's Gulf possessions. This 1780 chart narrows in on Pensacola Bay just before the decisive 1781 siege. It highlights entrance channels, anchorages, and the positions that fleets might hold. In effect, it is a blueprint for naval assault and defense on one of the Revolution's most important Gulf battlegrounds. This French carte réduite outlines Florida's coasts and interior features in generalized form. It shows French interest in a peninsula nominally held by Britain and Spain. By portraying rivers, lakes, and portages, the map imagines Florida as a land that could someday shift into France's sphere once more. Here, the emerging United States shares the continent with British Canada and British Florida. The map acknowledges American independence while keeping Florida outside the new republic's borders. It is a snapshot of a continent mid-revolution, with Florida still a loyalist refuge beyond the new nation's southern line. This French map binds Florida, Louisiana, and surrounding territories into a single Gulf-centered region. Colonial borders overlay native homelands and river networks. It reflects how European powers read the Gulf Coast as an interconnected theater rather than isolated colonies. Focusing on the entrance and roadstead of Pensacola, this chart is all about getting ships safely inside. Shoals, sandbars, and recommended tracks are carefully marked. For commanders planning the 1781 Spanish assault, charts like this turned a hostile shoreline into a navigable approach lane. This provincial map defines West Florida at the very moment Britain is about to lose it. Rivers, settlements, and boundary lines are laid out as if permanent. Within months, Spanish victory at Pensacola would make this carefully drawn British province vanish from the imperial map. Romans' paired maps of East and West Florida offer a Patriot-era synthesis of the peninsula and Gulf Coast. They blend hydrography, topography, and political commentary in a single image. For American readers, these maps explained why Florida mattered, even though it lay outside the rebelling 13 colonies. In the closing years of the American Revolution, Florida stands apart from the rebelling colonies, divided into British East and West Florida, ruled from St. Augustine and Pensacola. The 1781 chart by Bernard Romans traces the coast from the Mississippi and Mobile Bay, across the Gulf, around the Florida Peninsula, and up the Atlantic approaches. Every inlet, shoal, and sound is fixed by careful soundings and bearings, turning a once mysterious shoreline into a precise pilotage guide for warships and merchantmen. Romans had learned under Surveyor General William Gerard de Brom, whose own surveys set a new scientific standard for colonial mapping. Together, the charts of Romans and de Brom are widely regarded as the finest, most accurate maps of Florida produced in the 18th century, unmatched for their depth of coastal detail and hydrographic insight. In just a few years, Spanish victories at Mobile and Pensacola would end British rule here, freezing this map as a high-precision portrait of an imperial coastline on the eve of its fall. This fortification plan concentrates on the defenses around Pensacola Bay. Batteries, lines, and strong points ring the harbor against an expected siege. It visualizes the fortified shell Britain hoped would hold the Gulf just before Spanish troops cracked it. Here, Fort George itself is isolated in plan view, with bastions, ditches, and interior works carefully measured. This was the key British stronghold on the hill above Pensacola. When it fell to Spanish forces, British West Florida, and Britain's last real Gulf stronghold, fell with it. Drawn after the siege, this plan of Pensacola Bay reflects a harbor that has changed hands. The same waters and landforms now serve Spanish, not British strategy. The map closes the revolutionary chapter on Pensacola, marking a decisive shift in Gulf power. This 1782 map widens the lens to St. Augustine's countryside, rivers, plantations, and defensive lines. The town appears as one node in a broader occupied landscape. As the war wound down, St. Augustine remained a loyalist magnet and evacuation point for refugees fleeing the new United States. Tomás López's Spanish plan revisits St. Augustine at the end of the war, just as Florida returns to Spain. Streets, walls, and harbor facilities are carefully redrawn for a Madrid audience. The map marks Spain's reclamation of its old town, even as a new United States rises to the north. This French map of Louisiana and Florida closes the Revolutionary era with a Gulf-wide view. Borders reflect the new post-war settlement. Spain holding Florida and Louisiana, the United States established to the east. It is a cartographic epilogue, showing how the war reshaped who claimed the waterways and shorelines of the Gulf.